Habari za asubuhi, habari za jioni. Welcome everyone wherever you are. Thank you for joining our Kumbukeni family. Thank you for being here with us. We know today is an early one, and we appreciate you for being here with us early in the morning, for those of you who are in the Eastern Standard Time. We will be talking about our brother, our ancestor, our Baba, Malcolm X, also known as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. And we will be talking about his journey with Africa, his journey to Africa, and his journey with Africa in the way that he carries himself once he comes back from his trip to Africa. So again, my name is Nduku. I am a woman who is fed up with going along with the oppressive system and has decided to do something about it so that I can help us, Black people, get from under this oppressive system, or at least I can play my role in doing so. I will let my brothers introduce themselves. Today, we do not have a brother Adesoji with us, unfortunately, but he will rejoin us soon next week for our show. Brother Alimadi, Brother Colin.
Yes, greetings, family, sisters and brothers, to another episode of Kumbukeni, where we tie our history and the past solutions that our ancestors have already charted out for us and connected to deal with our contemporary challenges. And today, of course, we celebrate the life of one of our greatest ancestors, Brother Malcolm X. A fearless brother. Of course, we'll discuss the details. And he made the kind of connection with the motherland in the 1960s that is very lacking today.
Yes.
Malcolm knew that once we married the motherland with Africans in the diaspora, nothing would be able to stop us. So we need to continue that work. And that is why we're going to recall some of the things he did in charting that course. So welcome to today's episode. Over to you, Brother Colin.
Yes, good day to everybody. My name is Colin Benjamin. I'm the managing editor at Black Star News. I'm glad to be a part of this discussion today about the person who I think is the most, Milton just used the word, I'll use it again, the most, actually to, over this weekend as I've been reflecting on Brother Malcolm, I kind of came up with a new moniker for him. So I will call Brother Malcolm the fiery, fearless, the most fiery, fearless, formidable fighter that I think I've seen. I don't think I could put anybody over Brother Malcolm in terms of he was his just 100% uncompromising stand in terms of fighting for the freedom of all people. So I'm very glad to be a part of this discussion.
Yeah. Yes, and For everyone who does not know, our brother's birthday, our Baba's birthday, our ancestors' birthday was on May 19th. That is this past Friday, which is why we are honoring him today. And a lot of us all over the globe celebrated him in our own way. Let's dive right into it. Malcolm is going to Africa 1964. I believe he went to Africa in 59 to Egypt, right, Brother Milton?
Yes, briefly.
Yes.
But I think 64 is really the main journey when he really connected with the continent, when he realized the importance of making that connection. Because one of the main objectives that Malcolm wanted, he actually had two main objectives in terms of connecting with Africa. He wanted the newly independent African nations to bring up the issue of the racist oppression of sisters and brothers in this country before the United Nations General Assembly as a human rights violation issue. He said, if we could bring up the issue of South Africa's racist apartheid policy and oppression to the UN General Assembly, why not the racist oppression of sisters and brothers in this country?
Yes.
If we can bring out the racist oppression of Africans in the colonies, the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, why not the oppression of sisters and brothers in this country? If we can bring up the oppression of the Jewish population in Soviet Russia to the United Nations,
yes,
why not bring up the human rights violations against sisters and brothers in this country? So that was one of the main reasons. But the second main reason was that Malcolm realized that now that these African countries are independent sovereign states, they have resources to help sisters and brothers in this country to elevate their economic plight and condition, and to bring all the other issues and challenges that face them before the world community. And he also knew that with the skills level that some sisters and brothers in this country had acquired, they could also be very instrumental in African development.
He did.
And of course, he saw that in play when he went to Accra, Ghana, and he was hosted by, among others, Maya Angelou,
yes,
who was living in Ghana at that time, working in education and broadcasting. And there was a sizable African-American community that had migrated to Ghana to help the new government under Kwame Nkrumah. And they hosted him, and he saw the potential of what sisters and brothers could do in terms of helping these newly independent African states.
Yes.
And he also addressed students at the university in Accra, and he also met with the media there. But what is most surprising, and this really indicates how enterprising Malcolm was, number one. And then number two, how his message was being received globally. How can somebody, a brother with no official position, because by that time, he'd already been ejected from the Nation of Islam. But even had he still been the Nation of Islam, what kind of connection did he really have to be able to meet President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, to be able to meet Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, to be able to meet President Azikiwe of Nigeria, to meet Milton Obote of Uganda, to meet Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika, later Tanzania, to be able to meet Kwame Nkrumah, to be able to meet Sekou Touré. It means what he had been saying publicly and these leaders were listening to had impacted them, and they related to it. And that is why they granted him that audience.
Yeah.
You can't just walk off the streets and meet heads of state, because when a head of state hosts you, it sends a very powerful message.
Yes.
So even though Malcolm was seen as an enemy of the state in the United States, and these African leaders knew how malicious and retaliatorily vicious the United States government could be, they were still willing to put their necks on the line,
Yes.
literally,
Yes.
and meet with Brother Malcolm. So to me, that was a great attestment to his own skills and enterprising capabilities.
Yes. I would say that's a great example of self-determination by African leaders at that time, where they decide, so white oppressors, white Western nations, you've decided you won't acknowledge this man and his power and his presence. Guess what? We do not care what you think of him. We're going to recognize him as an African brother, which should happen more today, where African nations should not, and they're doing this in a way, especially we see it with the Ukraine situation, where they say, we don't care what the US, we don't care what the West thinks of this situation. We're making up our own mind. The other thing I see there is Malcolm. When he's growing up, his English teacher tells him he can never become a lawyer, right? He should give up that fanciful dream. But he goes to the UN and essentially is indicting the US. So he ends up practicing law anyway, in the long run. Brother Colin, talk to us. Talk to us. How about what makes Malcolm such a revolutionary? Where does it start? Where do you think it starts?
Well, I think is a couple of things. I think first of all, we have to remember Malcolm's father was a Garveyite.
Thank you.
Right? And in fact, a lot of the evidence points to the fact that his father's murder, where he was basically chopped in half, basically by a streetcar in Michigan, had everything to do with his UNIA activities, right? So I think that obviously is a starting point, as well as how his father dies. In terms of, earlier Milton, was talking about Malcolm's whole goal of connecting Africans and Africa and the diaspora. I think Malcolm was hardwired to do that earlier. I just think that because he was in the nation, he was being constrained to do that. There's also there's a video, and I think it's a couple of days after Malcolm's home was firebombed. There's a video in it where he actually talks about, and he's telling the people, hey, you notice that you never hear Mr. Muhammad speaking about Africa, where he actually points that out, right? So I think that Malcolm had always really wanted to do that work of uniting African Americans with Africans on the motherland, as well as in the Caribbean. And in that particular speech, if I'm not mistaken, it would have been like February 15th of 65. He kind of goes through that. So the Garveyism and the Pan-Africanism, I think that seed was planted early from his father.
Yeah.
And I think that when now he did the break, and then he's now traveling, through Africa, then it becomes a perfect opportunity for him to do things that I think deep down inside he would have always wanted to do. Earlier, Milton talked about, the fact that these heads of state met him and he didn't have any official position or whatnot. But what you also have to realize, they would have known and understood that the Nation of Islam really grew in terms of membership under Malcolm's direction. So even though he wouldn't have had any official position, they would have been clear that Malcolm is the one that really blossomed the membership of the nation, first of all. And second of all, they would have understood that Malcolm is the one doing all the media, press conferences, and they would have clearly understood that, this guy is an excellent communicator.
Right.
And you, sister, just mentioned about when he was told, when he was junior high, whatever, that, well, you can't be a lawyer, be realistic, you're a nigger. But you're correct. He always has been like a lawyer, advocating for all people all through, his career. And so for all those reasons is why they would meet with somebody like Malcolm. Because they understood the power that he had.
And he
also to add to what Brother Colin said, the influence of the late Dr. John Henry Clark.
Correct.
Remember, he became a very close mentor of Malcolm. And of course, Dr. Clark defined the essence of being an African man.
Yes. Right.
Professor Clark did.
Dr. Clark talks about him sending him requests for what he should read, and Dr. Clark recommending it, and Malcolm will dive right into the books and learn, right?
Right.
Go on, Colin.
No, because Dr. Clark once said that, he used to get him all these materials. Said, I never had him as a student, but I would have loved to. And, he talked about how Malcolm would just voraciously go through information and distill it, would pick out, the really germane points, and how quick he was at doing that.
Yeah. And like I said, in the African way of seeing things, Malcolm was Dr. Clark's student, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Clark, because
as all of us are, right?
Exactly, right. So the other thing, so the idea of us, what we do in Kumbukeni is we go back, take the lessons from our ancestors, from those who came before us, from those who've written and guided us through their words, and bring them to contemporary times. This journey and he ends up adding it into the program of the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, when he puts together a structured program with steps. And I encourage you all to get this book. In particular, has the program at the end with the steps, and I posted it in the comments. And I'm sure there's elsewhere where you can find that program. It is the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the organization that he started once he left the Nation of Islam, that he writes this program. And it has a step-by-step guide on what he believes we should do to be united. And one of them is we should travel to Africa. We should reconnect with our roots. And that's what he does by example. And that's what he's encouraging us to do. That's what we should do. Those of us who are in the diaspora, do not shy away from getting that passport and going to find out for yourself about the motherland. Do not let the Western media tell you about the motherland. Go find out for yourself. We have direct flights now. We have a flight straight from New York to Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. And from Nairobi, you can connect to any other part in Africa. So get out there and find out about Africa for yourselves.
And to add to that, sister, because a lot of people are making a lot of trips, actually, like the year of the return to Ghana. But we want sisters and brothers to go beyond, just going and taking selfies. At the great monuments that you find in Accra or elsewhere. So in order to do that, we need an understanding of what the system has done historically to divide sisters and brothers in diaspora with the motherland. And that comes through reading and critical analysis. So we will offer all the books that we've read dealing with Malcolm. Sister Nduku is going to make the titles available to you because Malcolm, as both of you have pointed out, understood the power of media. So I want to recommend two resources available on YouTube. One is the Oxford Union Debate, which is on YouTube.
That's a good one, yeah.
Where Malcolm discusses how the media can turn the devil into an angel and the angel into a devil. And the example he was giving was the Congo, where through Western intervention, the legitimate nationalist prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, had been murdered viciously. And Moise Tshombe had been installed in his place. And it says they keep referring to Tshombe as the premier of the Congo, when in fact he was the killer of the legitimate premier of the Congo.
Yeah.
And it gives many other examples of and instances where media have turned things upside down with respect to sisters and brothers in the diaspora and with respect to the African continent. So I recommend that strongly. The second one is a very short excerpt from a longer speech, but the short excerpt, which is also on YouTube, is called "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree." And there he discusses how during colonial rule, Western media fed the negative image of Africa. And as he says, jungles, cannibals, savages made Africa so detestable that sisters and brothers in the continent wanted nothing to do with Africa, and that was done for a purpose. But then he says, how can you hate Africa, which is your origin? And that's why he came up with that saying, you cannot hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree. So if your roots is in Africa, meaning you are the tree rooted in Africa, how can you hate your roots without then hating yourself?
Yes.
He says many of us hate ourselves unconsciously. We don't like the shape of our nose, our lips, our hair, even our skin tone. We hated the blood that flowed in our veins. It's only 6 minutes, but very powerful, and it puts things in context.
Yeah.
So I strongly recommend that as well. One other point I just wanted to add regarding Malcolm's trip to Accra, Ghana, what it did to him in a larger sense. When he was in Ghana, he met officials at the Cuban embassy. He met Chinese at the Chinese embassy. These are people that met him and even hosted luncheons or dinners for him. So they were very familiar with the struggle he was engaged in. And he also met the Algerians. And you know, Algeria was going through a very revolutionary period at that time, with the FNL defeating the French. And the Algerian brother said to Malcolm, you know, a lot of your critique is based on the oppression of the Black man. He says, but we have to go beyond that, because it's the oppression of more than only the Black man by capitalism and imperialism. So for me, as an Algerian, where would I fit into your model? As the Chinese, who's also critiquing the exploitation of capital, where would the Chinese fit? And the Cubans. And I think that's where he started really broadening his scope, so that toward the end of his life, he's now making a critique of capitalism and imperialism. So that's part of the maturation that also occurred during his African trips.
A great example for us that when we know better, we should do better, right? He goes, he learns about this, and when he comes back, he is a different man, a grown man. He's talking about, he understands what the target is now. He knows it's capitalism, right?
So let me jump in on one or two things here. So when Milton was just speaking, one of the things when he's just speaking about, you know, the self-hate aspect that has been indoctrinated in us. An important point to make here is that at that time in the 60s, right, Malcolm was really the only one really talking about Africa, like on a regular basis.
Right.
And the thing is, we should wonder to ourselves, why?
Very good question. Very good question. Very good question.
It seems to me that the reason why is that even some of the leaders, they are not comfortable with bringing in Africa. Maybe they themselves also have that self-hate, but maybe if not, they are worried that in interjecting it, that maybe they will throw off, their supporters might be like, oh, why we're not African stuff.
Exactly.
I remember when I was coming up, I heard a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
Don't tell me nothing about Africa, nothing. When I started getting into, when I actually became linked with the Rastafari movement, which that's a whole other story. I remember my aunt in particular is kind of like, why you want to be with this group that with this pro-Africa thing? The Africans them don't really like us.
Right.
And then it became a stunning thing some years after when me and Milton linked.
This African brother connects with you.
But not only that, when Milton actually signed a copy of his first book, The Hearts of Darkness, and I gave it to her, and she was pretty much speechless. and this is an aunt that she wasn't no speechless person. And she was pretty much speechless, and I knew that in that moment that she had a lot of regrets about saying stuff. But that type of self-hate thing it was very normal thing.
Right.
And even today,
absolutely,
much less we still have it.
Yeah. I agree, and we need a whole episode on that in the future. But go ahead, brother.
No, the other part let me jump back to is when you're encouraging people to make the trip.
Mm-hmm.
One of the two important things that happened in recent months was, well, not recent months. One in recent months was the speech that was given by the Ghanaian president when they had the so-called Africa-US Summit.
President Akufo, okay.
I think that is a great speech. If people get the chance to go on YouTube, because he makes a call, he uses the opportunity to make a call to Africans in the diaspora saying, we need you. And and in the speech too, he actually references Peter Tosh saying, because Peter Tosh and his son said, no matter where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. And he uses that line to make the call for Africans to come. The other thing here is the Africa CARICOM Summit that started 2 years ago. It's a very important initiative where you have the start of this relationship between the Caribbean. CARICOM is the Caribbean community leaders.
Right.
And what they're trying to do is start to now forge these different relationships. One of the things that they talked about was making it easy for us to go to the continent without having to have all this documentation and what's not. And of course, there are some countries, I think Ghana is one, where you could do the dual citizenship thing and all that, because the networking thing is key, because the unity thing is the key, which Malcolm also talked about in his organization there. You put the unity right within the name. And the last thing I'll say here is that in that same speech that I referenced earlier, that was a couple of days after his house was firebombed.
Yeah.
He had actually said at one point that Africa is the last hope. He actually said that.
He did.
Basically saying that if things aren't fixed on the continent, we over here, he's basically saying we got to fix it there so things here get fixed as well. If it don't get fixed on the motherland, it ain't getting fixed here.
Yeah.
All right. So in terms of Pan-African unity, let me just read something quickly that Malcolm actually wrote in the autobiography, which of course strongly recommend as a starting point for people that are not that familiar with Malcolm's work. Start with the autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. And this is what he writes in one part about this is what he told the press. Right here in the Western Hemisphere, probably 100 million people of African descent are divided against each other, taught by the white man to hate and to mistrust each other. In the West Indies, Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela, all of South America, Central America, all of those lands are full of people with African blood. On the African continent, even, the white man has maneuvered to divide the Black African from the brown Arab, to divide the so-called Christian African from the Muslim African. Can you imagine what can happen? What would certainly happen if all of these African heritage peoples ever realize their blood bonds, if they ever realize they all have a common goal, if they ever unite?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it gets any more powerful than that.
Right.
And I say this all the time in the spaces. First of all, it is so simply logical that it's frustrating that it's appearing to be so hard for our people to realize that our unity is our power.
Mm-hmm.
And Brother Malcolm definitely insists on that.
And sister, it comes from analysis, you see?
Exactly.
So our leaders, I know a lot of them like to be in front of the cameras, to be in front of TV, in front of the press, to be quoted and all that. But I wonder how many of them really spend time in analysis and critique and making the connections, so that by the time the camera is ever in front of you, even by surprise, you will never be caught unprepared.
Yeah.
You can tell that this came from analysis. He didn't just pick these thoughts randomly.
Right.
He had sat down, he analyzed the population of Africans in the Caribbean, in South America. He mentions Brazil. So obviously this takes some sitting down, thinking out carefully. So why am I saying this? I'm suggesting to our contemporary leaders, please do some reflection, do some analysis. It will put us in a much more powerful position. Imagine we're sitting here today talking about words uttered in the early 1960s.
Yes, indeed.
It means the words were well thought out, and that's why they're still relevant even today in the 21st century.
That's the Mwalimu in you speaking to the community and teaching.
See, let me say one thing here too.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So it's a lot of things, really, but this is also the reason, and I guess we were going to hit on this, of course, but this is also the reason why, Malcolm got blocked from, going into Paris.
He is stopped in France on his way.
Imagine that. No, yes, brother, I'll let you finish, but let me interject. Then finish. No, think about it. Yeah. They talk about, Western liberalism, free speech, open societies. No. And then listen to what the brother is telling us. Some people are not familiar with that incident. Yeah. So explain it fully, please.
Right. Well, it was, what year was that again? I forget what year it was when he was.
It was in 64.
Same trip.
64 too. Yeah. When he tried to get into the country and he was basically stopped. And he explained that, that basically the officers were telling him, well, we have our orders. That they wouldn't tell him much, and he basically said, "Well, I thought like maybe I was in South Africa in Johannesburg, or whatever." And he basically had said, "Well, I didn't know that you guys were a satellite."
But get deeper as to who is tracking him, so that he's stopped at that point.
Well, I mean, we know that all of the ABC.
Intelligence agencies,
FBI,
the FBI. Right? Yes. All of them were following him.
Right.
But other important thing that I wanted to say here too was, in the Caribbean too, right? He was banned. His writing and stuff was banned.
Yep.
Places like Jamaica. But Malcolm had also talked about the fact that even though he was led into England, but that the Crown, they didn't want him going to the islands. So like when, a lot of people, when they hear about Jamaica or whatever, they might think Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, whatever. But the government is this total opposite, right? Most of the leaders in not just Jamaica alone, in the whole Caribbean, most of them, they work for the crown.
Yes.
Right? So in a place like Jamaica, where you have a group like the Rastafarians and these type of people, they were getting shut down. And reggae music, it's only because of, ironically enough, it's Europeans that really made reggae a global thing. It's
Yeah.
not the government of Jamaica. The government of Jamaica was doing everything
Okay.
to stamp it
Okay,
out.
okay,
Right?
okay, brother. No, I'll let you continue, but because I don't want this significance to overpass some people that may not have caught what you're saying. The brother is saying an African government in Jamaica, a government of African descendants,
African appearing.
were crushing
Appearing, right?
Rastas, crushing the music. And then ironically, later on, it was Europeans who commercialized and promoted it globally.
And made
That's
money from
100%.
it.
That's 100%.
You can't beat that irony. Please continue.
That's 100% correct. It's like the breakthrough in the music mostly happened after Bob's trip to England, and he connected with people like what's that guitarist name I'm thinking of from Cream, that his only #1 song was when Bob said, yeah, you can cover No Woman, not no
I Shot the Sheriff.
I Shot the Sheriff.
Okay.
Clapton, Eric Clapton, right? It's it's a white Jamaican that helped Chris Blackwell, that helped make this breakthrough. And now the Jamaican government, they use reggae and everything.
Right. Brother. The point here, I want you to continue, but I want our people not to miss this. We don't need to wait for Europeans to legitimize what are the good things that we have or create or can create. If it's good, it's good. Don't wait for a stamp of approval from Europeans. Please continue, brother.
See, here's the other side note, real quick. I want to throw it to for the viewers. Just go and look at some of the past Jamaican, prime ministers like Alexander Bustamante, like Edward Seaga, and you will see like a colorism thing, because there's also a racial component too. A lot of these dudes were high yellow, as they would say, or near white. Right. And even some of the black ones, like Shearer was the one who was in power when they decided to ban Rodney.
They kicked Rodney out, under Shearer, right.
So like we have, it's just like on the continent, we have a lot of these guys that, they're black or whatever, but they work for Europeans.
Right, the European mind, European brains.
Yeah, and so in Jamaica and in much of the Caribbean, it was the same thing. Other thing here too, I don't know how many people in the eyes are, there's what you call a dub poet. Dub poetry is a subgenre of reggae. One of the famous dub poets is a person named Mutabaruka. Mutabaruka have a poem where he says, Negro, nigger, West Indian, which country do I belong? Part of it he says, West, yes, but I'm not an Indian, right? And but see, part of the importance of that poem, why I bring it up, is you would have a lot of Caribbean people, don't tell me nothing about Africa. I'm a West Indian. I'm a West Indian. So in that particular poem, what Mutabaruka is in part doing is critiquing that as well, saying West, yes, but I know Indian. Negro, but no Negro land. There's the other part of the poem where he said Negro land, but no Negro land. And then in it, he connects it to Africa, as well. But again, they try to stamp out the Rastafarians. When I went to Jamaica, the guy who was driving me around, which is an old Rasta guy, he was telling me about all the people who they disappeared, who was found floating in rivers, and all this type of stuff. The same type of brothers that Dr. Rodney was linking with and all this stuff. But now let me real quick, and then I'll stop there. We also connected to Marcus Garvey.
Right.
Marcus Garvey basically had got run out of Jamaica too with his ideas. Marcus
Yep.
Garvey's ideas took root when he went to Harlem.
Yes.
Yep.
And in fact, Marcus Garvey is really the Rastafarians in Jamaica that bring the love for Garvey in the homeland. But Marcus Garvey, especially at that point, would have been getting more love from African Americans than Jamaicans.
Yes.
Right? It's really
that love for him in the Caribbean came much later. In fact, in most cases, after his death.
And it came primarily because of the Rastafarians.
Yes. And their music as well.
And
promoting Garvey. Right.
Yes. So, I mean, what does this say about, our people? And we still have a ways to go, because some of those same type of leaders are still running some of these Caribbean countries. So.
And I like that connection, because Malcolm was a big part of the Garvey movement, because his parents were a big part of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was Garvey's movement, right?
Yes.
Like completely 100% active in the movement, and they got threats from the KKK. They got followed by law enforcement in the US because of it. And this is rooted in Malcolm. He doesn't talk much about his parents because of the trauma associated with that, but it is seen in who he is, in how he carries himself, and the way that he moves later in life after educating himself. So the thing we're taking here is this self-love, right? And self-hate that he talks about a lot. He was big on Black love. He was big on telling us that, which he asks us, who taught you how to hate yourself? Who taught you how to hate your nose? Who taught you how to hate your lips? Who taught you how to hate your hair? And every one of us.
So much so that you don't want to be amongst each other.
Right? So much so that you don't love each other. And this, again, I always bring this back to the organizations that we work in as Black people, the experiences that we have. We have Black people who are doing this work of keeping the system going, protecting the white oppressors, right? Cuddling them so that they don't feel bad because of how you're talking, which is why in the United States, we talk about Dr. King more than we talk about Malcolm X. Because Dr. King is the curated Black man that the West is comfortable holding up.
And see, but let's just say something too. Sister, you're hitting so many points, it's hard for me to be quiet. Right? But
let me just say, of Kumbukeni. That's why we have Kumbukeni.
But let me just say this though. We should also, as far as Dr. King say, that they make sure that they excise the
other king.
They don't speak of his radical self.
Right.
Yes.
It's just, about one day when little white kids and Black kids, like that kind of stuff.
Right. I have a dream.
Yeah, but they won't tell you about, say, a speech like Beyond Vietnam.
Beyond Vietnam.
Yeah. They won't tell you about all of the vitriol
and the conversations that he had.
The mountaintop speech, as well. This last speech,
they don't talk about the burning house and why he called it that.
Right. And actually, King, it was, often it's said that he had an evolution and was coming closer toward Malcolm toward the end. But I think that's only partly true. I think King was always very committed and connected to Africa. A lot of people are not familiar with a speech he made in 1957 when he was a mere 27 years old. Kwame Nkrumah had invited King. So Nkrumah had identified that even at 27, when King was not that well known, that this is a phenomenal young African brother from the United States.
Nkrumah was here. He went to school here. And he
went to school here,
right. So he knew King well. Yes, you're right. He went to HBCU, Lincoln University. So he invites King. and King goes to the Ghana's independence celebration. And when Dr. King came back, he made a speech, which I strongly recommend people go on YouTube and listen to. Birth of a New Nation. First of all, he's playing on words.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yes.
You know that racist,
that racist movie,
Yes.
that racist film, Birth of a Nation, right?
Yeah,
He's throwing some shade while educating us. Yeah.
Exactly. So his was called Birth of a New Nation. Listen to that speech.
Yeah.
King says clearly how much he learned and how much he was going to apply in the Black liberation struggle in this country, based on what he heard and learned from Kwame Nkrumah and Nkrumah's speech at the independence celebration. And just being there, King said when he saw the Union Jack being pulled up, down, and the new Ghanaian flag being hoisted up, the tears just started flowing.
He cried, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I recommend, if you've only heard I Have a Dream, or you only heard the Riverside speech, what other, go and listen to that 1957 speech. Obviously, and I say this to suggest this. Sometimes you live in a capitalist society like the United States. You're in the belly of the beast. Yes, you have to pay bills, you have to pay rent, you have to exist, you have to support your family. You know, you're in the corporate setting.
For now, yes.
But that does not mean you have to surrender your Africanness, your Africanity, your consciousness, your knowledge. You can be the daytime corporate individual, but don't abandon your consciousness and African sense. And it takes me back to that other underground film, which I strongly recommend. I don't know if it's on YouTube, but I know I have a DVD version. The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Yeah.
That is a classic underground film that shows you that even from the system, in the belly of the beast, you can learn a lot and come and have your people apply it to improve their conditions and improve their lives.
Yeah.
I actually, years ago, I was on regular communication with the author of the book that later on became that film. He lived in Chicago. He has now joined the Ancestors a couple of years ago. So I just wanted to say that as well. Just because you're in the system, it doesn't mean you have to be off the system.
And I'll go one step further. Quickly call.
Yeah, it's so much. You're not here. Gonna have to be disciplined.
I'll go one step.
I'm gonna have to be disciplined.
That's okay.
Let me just say one. But let me just say one thing, because as Milton was talking about that speech, and I remember the first time when I listened to that speech, it bringing me back to why I was saying earlier when I was asking the question about why some of these leaders wouldn't bring in Africa. Are they ashamed? Or no? When I was saying that, I was thinking about Dr. King, because I knew that he wasn't ashamed of it. But I think the thing here is now strategy.
Yeah.
You gotta talk about strategy. So he was probably, I would say, one of them that decided, okay, and maybe it wasn't him. It might have been people in the group.
Right,
said,
advisors and all that.
Yeah,
right.
that maybe, because remember with Bayard Rustin, who was an important person in the civil rights movement, right? Remember there was at one point, there was a thing where, we have to kind of keep Bayard Rustin at arm's length.
Because he was gay, so they are afraid of
he's gay, as well as, I think there was also saying, he's communist.
Right, Marxist-Leninist, right.
Stuff. So I think here, what you see is that, I think we could clearly say that Dr. King, it had nothing to do with him being ashamed of Africa, but it might have been more strategic. Will this turn off the masses of our people? Are they ready for it?
Exactly.
And of course, with the whole violent thing, because I've come across things that show that Dr. King at one point apparently had guns to protect the house and this type of stuff.
Right.
But then it ends up where he decides he think that nonviolence is, the kind of tactical thing. Of course, Malcolm was, when they attack us, we go self-preserve,
Right.
So,
and brother, to expand on King also, it's possible that he could have been like Julius Nyerere, Julius Nyerere, in an interview, he was asked about nonviolence and Mahatma Gandhi. And Nyerere said he was not a nonviolent philosophically. He said he supported nonviolence as a strategy. If it works, let's use it.
Right.
But if it's not worked, of course,
right.
He would support armed, liberation.
Right.
Yeah.
And Malcolm talks about a couple of things. First of all, I'm writing it down so that I don't forget my thoughts. This whole idea, I'll go a step further in Brother Milton's advice and say that bring your African self to those corporate spaces. Do not let the West determine who you're going to be, tell you how to be yourself. I bring my full African self to those spaces because when they hired you, they knew you were African. They saw your African name. So guess what? You're going to be African in those spaces because we are self-determining. That's what we're doing to liberate ourselves. And that's what Malcolm is telling us to do, to love ourselves and be self-determining. But I'll also talk about
and
Malcolm.
Sister, to add that to that, Malcolm,
brothers.
in the Oxford Union speech, you know what he said?
Yes.
He said, I am convinced that Europeans would respect you more if you exhibit your true self.
Right.
They definitely fear me. If that's a form of respect,
right.
They definitely fear me. But
instead of as they put it, wishy-washy,
Nobody likes a carbon copy.
We're not looking for their respect. We're looking for ourselves to be ourselves wherever we are, to take on our humanity as we please it to be. Yes, they will respect, but it's not about their respect. We don't care much about that. No. It's about being ourselves, our African selves. And the other thing I'll talk about Malcolm, as far as violence, is he says we have to learn their language, right? Their language is a language of brute force. You cannot approach people when you think about it. And you cannot approach me if I speak Kiswahili only and speak to me in English and expect us to have a conversation. You will have to come to me with an interpreter, right? Someone who can translate what I'm saying and what you're saying so that we can understand each other. And here he says the language is the language of brute force. You cannot come to that table with the language of peace when the only thing this person you're speaking to understands is brute force. So you have to use their language for them to understand what you're saying. How does that look like in Africa today? You cannot sit there and be told by the West when Africans are dying from COVID-19 that you cannot produce vaccination. You cannot sit there when you need to see a leader in one part of Africa to negotiate, to talk about how you're going to manage this pandemic in your nation and be told by the West, hey, how come you didn't call us to ask for permission? No, we don't do that anymore, Africans. We run African the way we want to run Africa. We don't wait for the West to tell us how to run Africa. That is what I hope we all take on. Brother Malcolm, another aspect to him, he's in a gathering and there's a young Sudanese brother who's brought in by a friend or one of the congregation. And Malcolm is talking, this time he is still Nation of Islam. And he's talking about the version of Nation of Islam in that gathering, and he's going about it. And this young Sudanese man, God bless him, who understands Sunni Islam, comes up and speaks and says, no, that's not what the Quran says. This is what the Quran says about that. And instead of Malcolm letting his ego lead, because there are people in the room who push back. Who is this speaking up? Why are you letting him speak? Because Malcolm says, no, let the man speak. Right? Essentially, he has knowledge to share. Let's listen and learn from it. And he shows, Brother Colin, Brother Milton, talk about that. Malcolm being the man who was not, because people talk about Malcolm being egotistic, right? They say that the way he approached things is because he had an ego. But here is a moment where we see him putting his ego aside and opening up an opportunity to learn better.
All right. So before I even respond to that, I have to say that just shows you how difficult it must have been for him to restrain himself when he was in the Nation of Islam.
Exactly.
Because obviously, many of the tenets of the Nation of Islam and what they taught, Malcolm, definitely knew was preposterous. That Europeans were created by Jacob, a mad scientist.
I cannot listen to that
I can't
video
in a laboratory. So obviously,
every time I listen
Malcolm
to
weighed that against the benefits that the nation was actually performing in terms of transforming
strategy.
people who had gone through, the hardest part of the system, imprisoned, their lives destroyed, led astray, and the nation was able to rescue them and turn them into very productive, accomplished individuals, including Malcolm himself, you see. Yes. So he weighed that in conjunction with the other aspects, which of course, he knew not to be true. And that was part of it. And also, the nation embraced aspects of Islam, aspects of Christianity, aspects of Black national liberation, and combined that into a package that was able to help transform the lives of people who had gone through such hardship, you see? Yes. So Malcolm did not know the Orthodox Islam. And he knew that. He knew he did not know, right? So when that young student, the Sudanese student, I think he was a student. Right. He was a student at Dartmouth, I think. When he came to the mosque, the temple, they call it, I think it was Temple number 7 in Harlem. Yes. And he heard Malcolm speak, and he knew this was not true. So obviously he was not going to sit quietly and, bless him for speaking out, and bless Malcolm for not being an autocratic tyrant who said, "You're in my space. How dare you upstage me like that? Please leave." That was the attitude of some of the congregants. But Malcolm said, "Oh, no. Let him speak his mind." Correct. And Malcolm learned from that student, and they ended up having a friendship and lifetime relationship. Yes. So that really says a lot, as you said, about Malcolm's character. Awesome. He really wanted to learn because they knew that learning had transformed him as a person. And and can you imagine?
And talk about a transformation. You all need to read the autobiography.
Yes, the autobiography of Malcolm X.
For those of us who sit and feel sorry for ourselves because we have a rough childhood and all that, read about Malcolm and
read because
the guy's father got nearly shot in
He got everything thrown to him.
The mother went to his mother
was institutionalized. Think about that. And that can have a debilitating lifetime trauma. Yes. And the final point I want to make is this. Read the autobiography because it may help you realize your potential that you have not yet tapped. Exactly. And that's my final comment on this.
It helped me in that way, I should say.
You know what, Colin? I'll let you talk about it real quick, but I actually do want you to talk about that. But before we do that, just want to remind everyone, please join us on Patreon and join our Patreon community at patreon.com/Kumbukeni. And Brother Milton, I always do this, but if you will allow me, I know you're okay with this. We're going to put it out on our Patreon page, but we are going to change how we run on Patreon. It's always been unsettling for me, the hierarchy format that Patreon has, where you have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and tier 1, if you pay this much, you get to see this and that. Tier 2, if you pay this much, you get to see and that. Kumbukeni is getting rid of that.
Yes, because Malcolm would not have liked that.
Exactly. Every member of our Patreon family will see everything that we have to offer. But we will allow you, based on your income, based on what you can afford, based on your responsibilities financially, to give what you can. So we will have the tiers, but you determine which one you want to join based on what you can give. But every member of the Kumbukeni Patreon family will have access to everything we have to offer moving forward. But as we speak about mothers, here, this one, the 3 mothers, if you want to learn more about Mama Little, right, and what happened to her, this is a book, and I did put it in the comments. And a lot of times we talk about Malcolm, and I understand why Malcolm did not speak much about his mother, because he blamed himself, and it's talked about in the in one of the books I shared. It's talked about in this one. No. Sorry about that. In the Sword and the Shield, they talk about it. He blamed himself for the condition that his mother ended up in because of things he did as a child. And you can read more about it in the books that we shared. But we
I don't think that was fair for him to blame himself. Nothing could have done to his
it
mother.
Wasn't fair. Of course it wasn't fair.
That was worse than the vicious murder of her husband.
Of course
his
it wasn't
father.
fair. Yeah,
Right.
it's this. I mean, when you read about the
But as a young person, we all,
there you go.
We do that.
As children, we end up doing this. We don't have a better understanding, but I am sure he comes to that understanding. The story of Mama Little, I will quickly throw it in because without our mothers, we are not who we are, right? Mama Little goes through this trauma where she loses her husband in such a tragic way, and she has to actually go witness his body in the state that it was in. So you can imagine the trauma there. And she has 8 children. 2 in the one. She was pregnant when that happened, just like Betty Shabazz was pregnant when Malcolm was killed. And she has all these children to take care of. And there are things happening. Malcolm is acting up as a young man. And she goes through depression. And what the United States government, what this system of the United States government decides to do is, because she was a Gaviist, not for any other reason, because she was an activist fighting against this system, they decide to claim that she had lost her mind, she was crazy, she was not in a position to be a mother, and they send her to a mental institute. The state forces her to go to a mental institute, and the state of Michigan takes over ownership of her children. And Malcolm does not come out of that ownership until when he moves to Boston with his sister at an older age. And it's ridiculous to me that a state can actually own our children. So that is something to think about as we continue to raise our families.
That is an ongoing process.
The role of the American government, the US government, and I have multiple stories. I actually am considering writing an article on Medium for those of you who follow me about another incident of a mother who was taken away from 7 children by the US government. The US government talking about caring about family and being a democratic nation that cares about family. It's not the Black family they're talking about. No, it's not. And there's evidence of that. One of them is Mama Little. There's evidence of that everywhere, that they're not talking about the Black family. And for Black people, it is about time we stop going along with this oppressive system. So I urge you all, Malcolm, integrity, right? That's one thing he teaches us. Integrity.
Yes.
He goes to France and he is stopped in France the same month that he is killed. Think about that. That's a correction. One of our community members corrected us. He was stopped in 1965 in February. That's the same month he was killed.
Right.
He knows he's being followed. He knows, he says himself, I will either die by the Nation of Islam or the FBI. Says that himself. But that does not stop him from speaking truth. These fears, and we all have these fears. When my brothers come on every Sunday, yes, I realize the risk that I'm taking to speak truth, but it will not stop me. Because like I said, I am done with going along with an oppressive system. I am done with seeing George Floyd and the multiple Black people who are taken down by this oppressive system. I'm done seeing that Newark is a food desert. And the people there don't have food. And when I go there, I see buildings come up. I don't see any gardens being put up by the government of that city. So we as Black people need to stop being fearful, like Malcolm says, and start standing up against the oppressive system. I'm talking about to the ones in Africa as well. Yes, they have killed our revolutionaries before, but if we don't speak up, we will continue being killed. Anyway, brothers, I can go on and on about this.
Well, let me just say, let me say this. We could have had twice as much time.
I know.
And we still wouldn't say enough. I'm trying to figure out, okay, which strand to jump on here.
Right.
Let's talk about women. Let's talk about women. Once you finish your thought, let's talk about women.
Okay, so real quick, the humility tip is big. Because one of our problems with leadership is the lack of humility. and the kind of egotism that goes on. One of the things that I was raised by my grandmother and my aunt. Probably can't see my aunt, but up there on the wall. One of the things that my grandmother drilled into me was humility.
Right.
And so when sister was a minute ago talking about the humility piece, I also thought about when I was on with you guys last and we talked about Dr. Rodney.
Mm.
And I mentioned to you that other dog poet, one of the things that he said when they met Dr. Rodney is the humility of this genius guy that, is this young PhD. And he was saying that he was stunned because usually these people are, their nose are up in the clouds and they know more than everybody else. And they won't, and he said that he was so stunned by that humility and that the fact that Dr. Rodney was coming to these groundings basically saying, well, yeah, show me my blind spots. So, and it's the same thing here, right? And actually, that lack of humility is one of the things that is hurting our organizations. When we have these leaders, sometimes they're not even grooming the ones to come behind, right? It's also, I think, a factor with these leaders like Milton's president, who been there for all these years and
Actually,
don't want to give up power.
Right. Actually, you're right. Let me start with that point you just made.
Oh my goodness.
General Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who, by the way, is only there has been there for 37 years because he's supported by the United States and by Britain. The U.S. gives him $1 billion a year in U.S. taxpayer financial support. They arm his military, they train his military. Britain does the same thing. And it's very similar to what happened in the Congo. After they killed Patrice Lumumba, they sustained Mobutu for 37 years in the same way. But going back to the point of humility, and I'm glad Colin actually reminded me of this, General Museveni once said, I am nobody's servant. I work for myself and for my family. This is the so-called president of a whole country, number one. Number two, he said, I'm the only Ugandan with a vision.
Imagine the size of
this is the person leading a country. Okay, so thank you for that. But going to the issue of humility, Malcolm was humble, gentle, polite, courteous, intelligent, and armed with the facts. So there's no reason for him not to be humble and gentle, because they knew his words were unassailable. So this to me suggests that sometimes when you hear some of our leaders shouting a bit too much, listen carefully. Are they really saying anything of substance? That's the point I want to make.
But Malcolm also says that there's a time to be gentle and there's a time to be rough. Right?
Of course. Right. And even in his roughness, I'm sure he would have done it in a very gentle way. And then Rodney, look how humble the brother was. Listen to any of his speeches. Listen to Race and Class in Guyanese Politics.
Yeah.
Listen to Crisis in the Periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. And what I like about Race and Class in Guyanese Politics, the speech he gave at Columbia, at the end, some students were critical, asking, reactionary questions. And his response, very gentle, polite, but just demolished the questions in a very humble and gentle way. And let me give you one other example of humility. Our brother, the late Professor Anta Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop, he was challenged by a student at the university in Dakar, in Senegal. And the student asked him his teaching, something he'd proven actually, that the ancient Kemet, aka Egypt, were Black Africans, right? And obviously did it by the scientific testing of the melanin content from the mummies from ancient Egypt, and found the melanin content was that of Black Africans.
Yeah.
So this is a young student Senegalese asking. He said, if what you're teaching us is true, why aren't the professors and scholars in Europe accepting it? You know? And this was his response. He said, okay, so you consider yourself to be a bright, intelligent student? So say, why, yes, of course. I said, okay, is it possible that one day, given your intelligence, your genius, you're doing studies and research, that one day you're going to discover something? I said, yes, of course it's possible. I said, once you do that, are you going to wait for Europe to endorse your discovery? The student just was humbled and had to just walk back. You see? And sometimes that comes by thinking the process. Another professor might have gotten insulted. He said, how dare you student insult me, blah, 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 and shouted at the student. But no, he used that as a teaching moment.
It goes beyond humility, that lesson there, right?
Yes,
it goes beyond humility. He is essentially telling us, do not wait for the West to tell you
what
is okay.
Yes. Sister, let me give one more example from Kenya.
You. And then let's go to the women, please.
When Malcolm traveled to Nairobi in 64. And he met, Kenyatta, he met Tom Mboya, he met Oginga Odinga, the father of Raila Odinga, met all these dignitaries. He met Dr. Njoroge Mungai, who was a very prominent politician in Kenya and one of Kenyatta's key advisors. And then the US ambassador, William Atwood, came and confronted Malcolm and said, you're a racist. And Malcolm basically just laughed him off, But then Ambassador Atwood went to Njoroge Mungai and admonished him for meeting with Malcolm. He said Malcolm was undesirable. And Njoroge told him that he is not an undesirable to me.
Thank you.
Or to Kenyans.
Thank you.
See, that's what we need to have in Africa. We need to have fearless leaders who are willing to defy imperialism and the US and make that connection that Malcolm was trying to cement between the continent and Africans in the diaspora.
Yes. And you talk about Kenya as I want to bring in the women and as I want to quickly go to questions from the audience. But you talk about Kenya and I cannot not mention, in his speeches, he calls it Mau Mau, but we call them the Kenya Land and Freedom Army.
Right.
He talks about them and he says there should be one in Harlem, there should be one in Detroit, there should be one in Chicago, there should be one everywhere. He talks about them with pride, talks about how they were heroes, talks about how they fought for the freedom of Kenya. He takes that movement from just one country in Africa and brings that mindset here that we should defend ourselves when our communities are under threat. We should defend ourselves. It is our right to defend ourselves. Listen,
I think that's on YouTube too. It's on YouTube. It's
yes, it is.
To the grassroots.
I put it in the chat. I did put it in the chat, at least a small clip of it.
All right, thank you.
Here's the thing for me, for the two things. Number one, let's talk about ego. People, I believe, confuse, and I am only 43 years on this earth, and I know there's a lot I don't know. But for my 43 years, from the reading that I've done, from the learning, from the skills, from the wisdom that I have in my 43 years, this is an analysis I am making. I am realizing that our people are confusing ego with speaking the brutal, blunt truth. And Malcolm is confused for being egotistic because he's going out there and saying the truth plain, without worrying about quoting it with lovely language that will make you feel comfortable or whoever else that you care about. Same thing with Walter Rodney. He speaks, when you listen to his speeches, plain. He's literally having satirical moments, criticizing the system while teaching you, which is Malcolm is very good at that. But here's the thing. I've encountered a lot of criticism when I go out there to speak plainly. And I encourage you all, when you face that criticism, and a lot of it is from people who look like us. The way you're saying it, oh, there's a certain way to say it. I'm saying I'm speaking the truth. Oh, but there's no certain way to say it. Because these white oppressors do not get it when you use a certain way to say it. And they find loopholes to excuse their oppressive ways when you find certain ways to say it. So the best thing to do for us who are seeking liberation is to say it as plain and simple as it is. Call it what it is a lesson I'm learning as I continue to learn from our revolutionaries.
Express yourself, huh?
Exactly, as it is, plain and simple. This is not supposed to be kumbaya moment where we are all loving each other while we're talking about oppressors taking lives of African people left and right. Women, Malcolm has an interesting relationship with women. You can learn about his younger ways. They talk about him being a pimp. You can learn all about that in the autobiography and all these other books that we have shared. But he transforms, he learns, he knows better, and he does better. And he comes back from Africa, and he's talking about the nations, the areas where he went where the woman was not educated, they were not developed. They were not doing well. The areas where he went where the woman was educated, they were developed. And he emphasizes this point, this issue of educating the woman in a community before we even do anything else. For that community to prosper, we have to educate the woman. And his respect for womanhood is so strong towards his end. That is something that we cannot mention as we speak about him today. And
you mean that we can mention?
We can't. No, we cannot not mention.
Okay.
Yes, we cannot not mention as we speak about him today. And he talks about the women that he sees in Africa, right, with such pride. But brothers, Malcolm and women, Black women especially.
Well, he wrote in, and this is also in the book by Les Payne, the late Les Payne, who was a good personal friend of both of us, myself and Colin, and his daughter, Tamara Payne. The book is The Dead Are Arising. And in that book, there's a part here, quote, "In every Middle East or African country I have visited, I notice the country is as advanced as its women are, or as backward as its women," he wrote. He wrote this 1 week before his assassination. And then he also continued, quote, "Thus, in my opinion, Muslim religious leaders of today must reevaluate and spell out with clarity, the Muslim position on education in general and education for women in particular. And then a vast program must be launched to elevate the standard of education in the Muslim world. An old African proverb states, educate a man and you educate an individual. Educate a woman, you educate an entire family," end quote.
Yeah.
This is Malcolm writing. This is recounted in Les Payne's book, The Dead Are Arising. So that sums it up for me.
And two things that does sum it up, but as we talk about that, two things can be true at the same time. He can be a devout Muslim and still criticize the system that is governing these Islamic nations, that is preventing women from progressing, that is not honoring their women, right? He did that even as he remained a Muslim. So I'm gonna go to the questions in.
Well, don't I get to say one or two things here?
Yes, you Please. Can say one or two things, but I want to get the questions.
So let me just real quick. Let me say this.
Oh yes, about women. Go ahead, Brother Colin. I'm sorry. Yes.
So let me just say this. Yesterday, I was privy to this little like an argument online where this younger sister, apparently she's just reading the book and she has some channel, and I guess she's in the part of Malcolm X autobiography where he's talking about him being a pimp and this and that. She apparently went online.
We might have encountered the same video. Yep.
She apparently went online and said whatever, and I guess some people were clapping.
She's talking about misogyny,
saying he was misogynistic.
I responded to her the same video.
No, okay, good. So what my thinking with this sister, and maybe if she's watching, is that there's a difference between the early
exactly
Malcolm, and he himself. It's not like he hid it. He told everybody, "Hey, I was a criminal. I did this. I did this." He didn't hide any of it.
He went to jail. He went to
jail. Yeah. But what she also needs to know, and maybe I apologize. guess the firehouse.
it's part
I guess
of
I'm bringing
living.
fire. I guess I'm
Yes.
bringing fire. So the
Yes, you are.
firehouse is now
It is
coming
part
on,
of
right?
living in the heart of imperialism.
Yeah.
Let me continue. Mute for a quick second, and I can continue in that story, and then you'll come back on it. Brother Colin, quick mute on that. Yeah.
I think his mute is not
He
working.
muted us. Hold on, let me see whether I can mute him. There we go. So yeah, because no one is trying to be listening to that right now. Brother Colin, we love you, but we're gonna pause you for a minute and I can go on with the story.
No, but when it's over, put your thumbs up so we know.
Yeah, definitely let us know so that I can you're good?
Yeah, unmute him, I guess. He put his thumb up.
Hold on, let me unmute him.
They don't want me to make this point, I guess.
Are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. They
Go
just
on.
wanna. So the point, the other thing I was gonna say here is somebody should remind the sister that Malcolm also said the Black woman is the most oppressed person in the world, right? And what my perspective too is because of what he had done, you know, with being involved in pimping and stuff.
He became a much better person.
He understood that. The sister should also realize that one of the things that got him basically kicked out of the nation was when he decided, I'm gonna out, right? This person who has been my mentor because of what he has been doing.
You have to name him, brother. Elijah Muhammad.
Elijah Muhammad.
Maybe the brother is choosing not to name him for a reason, but
no, I mean, you know, we've been talking about the nation. We have to name the leader of the nation.
So when Malcolm decided that he was gonna out him because when he found out that, you know, he's sleeping with all these teenage, not just sleeping with them, he have all these pregnant teenage women,
but not
owning them, right? So the sister should take all of that into consideration, right? And not just look at what he did when he was a young person. Look at where his evolution, and I would say that because of some of those things that he did, he learned from it. And my last thing that I will say, I might be wrong on this, but I think had Malcolm lived, other clash would have happened with him and some of these Islamic countries and what they do with women. I think that would have happened.
Yeah,
right. That's just my, you know, that's just
to the sister. I will and I said my piece in the comments on her video. So again, the lesson here for us is to do our due diligence and do the research when we get on these spaces and speak to the community, because we are educating, and we don't want to continue the miseducation. I could have done things as a child. What have I learned since then? Have I learned and done better since then? Look at my actions now and not then, especially if my actions are showing that I realize I was wrong and I am changing and doing better. Sister, do you want to get on and talk about Malcolm being a misogynist? Go ahead and do that. Specify when it is that he did that.
And also, does she want...
No, but comrades, in fairness to her, maybe she's ignorant about the later Malcolm. That could be possible.
She is completely ignorant. It was she
exposed
herself.
So we have to just advise her and say, sister, with all due respect, you are incorrect because Malcolm is wrong.
Which is what I essentially did in the
And I might be wrong, but I don't think she finished the book either. I think
there's no way.
Reached that point.
There is no way.
So we should adopt the same tone that Malcolm would adopt when teaching others. You know,
my one thing,
and this really, we just tell her calmly, sister, there's more reading that you still need to do. After you've completed those reading, if you still have the same views, then we have our doubts about you. So we invite you to do those readings and make another follow-up video.
Correcting, Right. Make another video to correct.
That's all we have to say.
The last thing I will say on that is
but we're running out of time. If we don't take any of the questions, we're not going to. Are there any questions?
All right. Okay. We need more time.
This needed way more time.
We'll do a follow-up. Definitely, we'll do a follow-up.
More time. When we need to figure out where we can continue the conversation. So our brother Kokayu Fanifu asks, what system will we replace capitalism and imperialism to better humanity?
First of all, there's surveys in this country that now shows that the majority of young people now favor socialism over the current system. I'm reading a book right now by Thomas Piketty, whose other famous book was Capitalism in the 21st Century. This French economist, he's a very bright guy actually. And the book, the title is It's Time for Socialism. And essentially saying you may not like, the word socialism, because unfortunately, when people hear the word, automatically they identify it with the Soviet Union and the autocratic system that they had in the Soviet Union. But it says that should not be seen as the prototype of socialism, because the word, after all, was not invented for the Soviet Union. Yeah. The word existed before the Soviet Union. So whatever they did, perhaps we should not characterize that as what socialism is. Yeah. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere called himself a socialist, you see? So he says, but this is what the essential is this. We cannot have the type of exploitative capitalism that now prevails globally in the US and in Europe. It's just creating misery and destroying the earth environmentally. So that's why we need a new system. So I'm glad that an economist who said in the introduction of the book that when the Berlin Wall came down, he was celebrating that as the triumph of capitalism. Now, he's a few decades later, much more wiser, he's saying, oh, no. This system will not sustain the earth. It will destroy the earth. So whatever word we come to describe it, he says it has to be a much more democratic system, politically and economically. If we still have enterprises running, we can't have where the CEO is the one who decides everything. Yeah. And he gave example of Germany. He said, Germany, the system is much better in Sweden because when you have the board of directors, the board is 50-50, workers and management. Yeah. Workers have to be involved. Otherwise, the system is just going to collapse.
So being an African and going back to an African way of thinking of things, I don't even use the word socialism. We have African ways of describing this. In Kiswahili, we call it ujamaa. But simply, it is a practice where you think about the collective. A practice, a way of being where you're more concerned about the collective and not the individual. You put the collective before the individual. When you have food, you make sure that everyone has food. When you have water, you make sure that everyone has water. When you have electricity, you make sure that everyone has electricity. It is simple.
Wouldn't the term be African communalism?
That's the term right there. Where we...
Or even beyond that, I think it should be humanity. Think about the word humanity. Humanity is Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. Thank you.
Yeah. That is the word. African word.
There is a member
humanity
of the community who is lacking, you make sure they get what they need. You make sure that there is no member of the community
in an African community and visit homes and not be offered what?
First of all, you don't even go without food. That's the thing. It's like it's both ways.
People are insulted if you refuse food. So you start dodging visits because you can't refuse food either. So if you're visiting 5 homes in an African setting, you're going to have to eat 5 times. You see,
this is something from our African culture that I brought with me. I have situations where I'll say, I want to have lunch, I want to do this, and so I'll be with someone and they'll say, go ahead. I'm like, no, I'm not comfortable eating while you're not eating.
Exactly. I remember when I was a freshman at Syracuse decades ago, I just arrived. I was sitting in the student lounge where we were watching TV. I ordered like pizzas, large pies of pizza, because I'm with, maybe with 10 or 12 other students, ordered maybe 3 large pies and drinks, invited everybody. We ate, we drank. The next day I'm sitting there watching TV, another student sitting next to me, invited a large pie, it came, they opened it and, he took a bite. I'm waiting, for him to invite me. I'm looking at other people. Everybody else is watching TV. As if it's something normal.
Yes.
I was the only one who found it strange
because that's
that
Western
this student
culture.
sat there and ate the entire pie by himself. Even though yesterday he was grabbing my, I could never bring myself to be
Because that
comfortable to
is
do that.
Western culture. And
Right.
they
So I would
infected us.
order and I would go and now eat in my room and then
Yeah.
come back and watch TV with them.
And that's what capitalism
And you
is.
see too, let me say it too, like that same thing that Milton is talking about. That was one of the things that survived in Caribbean countries, because that same thing you will see going to any number of Caribbean countries where the people don't even know you, but you came with whoever, and well, we got to make a plate for Milton and Sister and Duku too, because they're here, right?
Yeah.
But only thing is that slowly but surely we have made these people erode
Yeah.
Right.
things that
They have made us become more individualistic and taken us away from our collective, our brotherly, our sisterly way of being, and we must return. You cannot be prosperous. You cannot be living in a mansion right there when your neighbor is living in a shack and rain is coming in every day and you don't tell them, come in and stay with me.
And right here, I should say shout out to Bernie Sanders, because I think he has been trying for these years, trying to get the country started on that part, and they have done everything
to frustrate him.
Kneecapping him.
Right. In fact, Thomas Piketty writes about him in his book as well.
And as we speak about Bernie Sanders, and as we have this platform that has the potential of reaching people, my advice, my ask of Bernie Sanders is mentor a younger person, sir. You're getting old. It's okay, but your wisdom
he has
is
quite a
still
few.
He has,
but mentor
he's doing a good job compared to the others.
Mentor a person who can be, and then for us, the voters, is let's follow what he's doing, because he is the only politician today, the only one, unless we're talking about his mentors, the only one who thinks about the collective and not the individual.
But remember too that AOC came right out of his camp.
But even AOC is not really there yet. She has some growing to do as far as embracing the collective.
She's learning. Yes. Sister, are there any more questions though?
The other one, I think we answered. Do you think Brother Malcolm would have eventually challenged the ideas regarding equality of women with men and the political structures? Yes, we do think he would have. And yes, we are going over time. That's okay. We are Africans. We go with the flow.
I have to run in 5 minutes, though, comrades.
Yes, our brother talks about Ubuntu. It is prevalent. Let's find out where it is and what they are doing. And we thank you all for being here. Quickly, last minute words, brothers, quickly, as we go over the time.
All right. So I like the fact that Morocco was able to meet with all those African presidents that I mentioned earlier. I like the fact that he was able to attend the Organization of African Unity's second annual meeting in Cairo in 1964. And even though he did not get them to endorse taking the issue of human rights abuse of Africans in this country to the United Nations, he at least got them to issue a statement concerning human rights abuse, or racism rather, in this country. That was quite an accomplishment from an individual who was not accredited or attached to a major organization. And also, it seems he was a bit disappointed that Kwame Nkrumah also was not willing to bring the issue up of human rights abuse of Africans in this country to the United Nations. But of course, Malcolm was unaware of the dangers and threat that Nkrumah was already facing at that time. Nkrumah himself knew his days were numbered. And that's quite clear if you read White Malice, the book by Susan Williams about the CIA. Yes, there you go.
And it talks about Malcolm too and the CIA, yeah.
Right, and the recolonization of Africa. So those are my closing statements.
Brother Colin.
Thanks for having this. I mean, we could have had twice this time and we still wouldn't have hit everything. The only thing, I could say so much, but I'll keep it short. The thing I'm gonna just emphasize here is, like, a lot of the times, of course, when people talk about Malcolm, this aspect that we hit on a lot today about connecting the diaspora.
Yes.
That's the central part that I would like people to go away with. This is the reason why he named his organization Afro-American Unity, because he's trying to get all of us in that alignment right? So the thing that I would want people to take away the most from is we need to do the networking, the connecting, to unify with one another and stop letting these people bring this kind of disunity, this divide and conquer thing. And so that particular aspect of what he was doing to the end of his life, let's keep that in focus.
Yeah.
African
Sister,
unity.
can I read something from the autobiography of Malcolm X very briefly?
I thought you had to go in 5 minutes. Go
I have
ahead,
to,
brother.
but this emphasizes what Colin
Go
just
ahead,
said.
brother.
I think the worst mistake of the American Black organizations and their leaders is that they have failed to establish direct brotherhood lines of communication between the independent nations of Africa and the American Black people.
Yes. My last words, thank you for that, is read the basic unity program. You can either read it on this book, which we put in the comments, and I think there are sources. That is the basic unity program of the Organization of Afro-American Unity that Malcolm started here. And his goal with that was to connect more with the civil rights movement in the US and to connect more with the liberation movements in Africa. So go ahead and read that. We thank you all for joining us. Thank you, brothers, for being here. We look forward to having our brother Adesoji back. We missed him today. And Sikunjema. Let's continue the good work.
A luta continua.